Ruth stepped carefully, the earring resting in her palm. The saleswoman's gaze bore down on her, exuding an air of authority. Her neatly pressed suit and rigid posture made it clear she belonged to this world of luxury, while Ruth, in her simple coat and worn leather purse, did not. Ruth smiled politely, lifting the earring slightly, explaining that she had accidentally knocked it over and was about to put it back. The saleswoman's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flicking over Ruth's belongings before settling back on the jewelry case. Her tone remained cold as she acknowledged Ruth's words, but the suspicion in her posture was unmistakable. Ruth had encountered this kind of look before. A lifetime of experiences had taught her to recognize it instantly. An older black woman, alone in a high-end store standing near expensive jewelry, it was an all-too-familiar assumption. She placed the earring back on the display stand, her fingers steady despite the unease building in her chest. The saleswoman did not move, her lingering presence making it clear she was still watching, still doubting. Ruth sighed inwardly. She had spent her life navigating moments like these, from store clerks following her mother down aisles in the South to her late husband being mistaken for a janitor at the school where he had taught for decades. And now here she was in a store built by her own son, still facing the same silent judgment. Taking a deep breath, she spoke with calm confidence, mentioning that she was simply admiring the pieces and that her son, Eric, owned this store. She visited often. The saleswoman's expression flickered with uncertainty, a brief hesitation that revealed she was re-evaluating the situation. Before she could respond, the front door chimed, and Eric stepped inside. His tall frame moved with familiarity through the store, his gaze instantly finding his mother. A warm smile spread across his face as he greeted her, his voice filled with affection. The saleswoman's posture shifted, realization dawning as she connected the dots. A small moment of discomfort passed over her features as Eric casually introduced Ruth as his mother. The saleswoman cleared her throat, suddenly flustered, stumbling over her words as she tried to backtrack. Ruth watched with a quiet understanding, giving a knowing smile, shaking her head slightly. She had long since learned that some lessons were better left unspoken. Eric's eyes flickered between them, instantly grasping what had happened. He did not have to ask. He knew. The weight of the moment hung in the air, an unspoken reminder of how deeply ingrained these assumptions ran. Ruth studied the saleswoman's face, trying to place her, but she was unfamiliar. She must have been new to the store, yet the coldness in her gaze felt all too familiar. There was no kindness, no warmth, nothing like the welcoming atmosphere Ruth had grown used to in the store her own son had built. She tried not to let it bother her, offering a gentle explanation as she carefully stood up. She apologized, mentioning how the earring reminded her of a pair she once owned, but the woman didn't let her finish. The sharp glare from the saleswoman cut through Ruth, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. There was something in her, expression beyond mere disapproval, something Ruth had seen before. Her voice was crisp and cold, slicing through the air as she demanded to know what Ruth was doing. The hostility in her tone was unmistakable, her narrowed eyes filled with distrust. Ruth, caught off guard, steadied herself and held up the earring lightly between her fingers, her voice calm but firm as she explained that she had only knocked it over by accident. The saleswoman's lips curled into something bitter, her voice laced with pure accusation as she interrupted, twisting Ruth's words into something ugly. Admiring it, or pocketing it? The accusation landed like a slap, thick with assumption. Ruth's breath hitched, disbelief washing over her. Pocketing it? That was ridiculous. She had never, before she could even finish, the woman's eyes raked over her again, lingering on her simple coat and worn purse. There was a flicker of something cruel in her face before she leaned in, her words sharp and venomous. People like you don't belong in stores like this. The weight of those words sank into Ruth's chest like a stone. The unspoken message was clear, woven into years of experience she had hoped were behind her. Her hands trembled slightly as she extended the earring back, her voice faltering as she tried once more to explain. But the saleswoman wasn't interested in explanations. She stepped forward and snatched the earring from Ruth's hand with a force that made her flinch. Her voice was harsh, dismissive, filled with finality as she snapped that there was no need for excuses. She was calling the police. The saleswoman gripped her phone tightly, her voice eerily composed as she spoke to the dispatcher. She reported the supposed crime with practiced ease, as if she had no doubt that her version of events would be accepted without question. Ruth barely registered the words, only the crushing weight of them. Detained. The word echoed in her mind, surreal and terrifying. She clutched the strap of her purse, her fingers tightening around the worn leather, as if grounding herself could stop the chaos unraveling around her. The front door swung open, and Ruth heard the firm, heavy steps of two uniformed officers entering the store. Their expressions were unreadable, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to the warmth this store had always represented to her. Without hesitation, they made their way to the saleswoman, who wasted no time launching into an exaggerated retelling of the supposed theft. She pointed at Ruth with the certainty of someone who expected to be believed. She accused her of attempting to steal, of being caught in the act, of needing to be stopped before she could escape. Ruth's hands trembled as she tried to interject, her voice faltering against the weight of the accusation. She pleaded, insisting it was a mistake, that she had only knocked the earring over by accident, that she was the owner's mother. But the officers barely acknowledged her words. Instead, they exchanged a brief glance before turning their focus back to the saleswoman, her words carrying more weight than Ruth's truth ever could. One of the officers finally turned to her, his gaze cold and detached, instructing her to step forward. Ruth did as she was told, her knees unsteady beneath her. She tried again, her voice barely above a whisper, but before she could utter another word, one of the officers grabbed her arm, yanking her roughly to the side. The sudden force made her stumble, pain shooting through her wrist as they twisted her hands behind her back. She let out a gasp, shock and humiliation flooding her all at once. The sharp click of handcuffs snapped around her wrists, the sound cutting through the store like a slap. Ruth stood frozen, too stunned to move, her breath shallow as tears welled in her eyes. She searched desperately for a familiar face, for anyone who might stand up for her, but there was no one. Just the saleswoman, watching with a satisfied smirk, as if she had won something. Ruth's voice cracked as she tried again to defend herself, but it was no use. The officer's response was cold and final. She could explain herself at the station. The words struck her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. In all her years, she had faced hardships, had endured struggles, but never had she been treated like this. The weight of the injustice pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. She felt like a criminal, even though she had done nothing wrong. The officers began leading her toward the door, their grip firm, their pace unrelenting. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, for some explanation that would make them stop, but nothing came. This was her son's store, a place that had always been safe, and yet, in the blink of an eye, it had turned into a nightmare. Eric's suit, usually pristine for business meetings, bore slight creases as if he had rushed back in a hurry. His sharp gaze swept across the store, taking in the sight of his mother, handcuffed and shaken, flanked by two officers, while the saleswoman stood smugly to the side. His jaw tightened, his movements sharp and deliberate. Without hesitation, his voice cut through the tense air, firm and controlled as he ordered the officers to remove the cuffs. One officer hesitated, shifting uncomfortably before offering a weak justification. They were merely responding to a theft complaint. But Eric's patience was already razor-thin. His command came again, sharper this time, each word clipped and precise. His dark eyes locked onto his mother, his anger momentarily softening as he asked if she was okay. Ruth nodded weakly, her voice trembling as she reassured him, though her shaken demeanor spoke louder than her words. She had done nothing wrong, only dropped an earring. Eric's gaze snapped to the saleswoman, his expression turning cold as ice. His voice carried restrained fury as he addressed her by name, demanding an explanation for why she thought calling the police on his mother was necessary. Miss Turner faltered, her confidence cracking. She stammered, trying to defend herself, but her words only dug her deeper. She hadn't known Ruth was his mother. She thought she was stealing. Eric's anger ignited. His voice rose, each word cutting like steel. What gave her the right to assume his mother was a thief? Miss Turner's feeble defense crumbled under the weight of his fury. She had been protecting the store, she claimed. But Eric scoffed at the notion. Protecting the store from his own mother? The insult ran deeper than just an accusation. It tainted the very foundation of everything he had built. He motioned toward Ruth, his voice unwavering as he demanded, "Miss Turner, truly look at her. Did she look like a criminal?" Miss Turner opened her mouth, but no words came. Her silence was answer enough. Eric turned back to the officers, his patience spent. The cuffs still bound Ruth's wrists, and his glare burned into them as he demanded to know if they had any real evidence or if they had simply acted on blind assumption. The weight of his words settled uncomfortably between them. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before one finally stepped forward and removed the cuffs. The moment. Ruth's hands were free. Eric was at her side, gently rubbing her wrists where the metal had bitten into her skin. His voice softened as he whispered an apology, one layered with guilt and sorrow. She had never deserved this. Ruth shook her head, her voice barely audible. She didn't understand how it had escalated to this point. Eric's anger flared again, this time with finality. His gaze locked onto Miss Turner, his voice steady and unforgiving as he ended it right then and there. She was fired. She wouldn't represent his business for another second. The color drained from her face as she scrambled to protest, but Eric cut her off with a single, unwavering command. He didn't care. He didn't need people like her in his store. She fumbled with her belongings, avoiding the judgmental stares around her before hurrying out the door. Next, Eric turned to the officers. His words were just as cutting. They owed his mother an apology. The humiliation she had endured was unacceptable. One officer hesitated before mumbling a weak apology. Ruth simply nodded, her expression unreadable. The damage had already been done before returning with a guilty verdict. Miss Turner was convicted of assault and defamation, her actions deemed reckless and unjustified. The judge's sentence was swift, a fine, community service, and mandatory sensitivity training. Though it wasn't a severe punishment, it was a public acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, eager for a statement. Eric stood firm, his voice unwavering as he addressed the crowd. "This was never just about my mother. It's about accountability. No one should be judged by their appearance or assumptions, and no one should be treated the way she was." Ruth, standing beside him, remained quiet, the weight of the experience still lingering. She knew justice had been served, but the scars of that day would take longer to heal. As the days passed, life slowly returned to normal. Golden Grace Jewelers regained its reputation not just as a store of elegance, but as a place that stood for integrity and fairness. Customers returned, some offering Ruth kind words and apologies for what she had endured. One afternoon, Eric found her standing in front of the same glass case where it all began. This time, there was no hesitation, no sorrow in her eyes. He smiled, gently placing a small box in her hands. Inside, Nestled in velvet were the diamond earrings she had once admired. "They're yours, Mom," Eric said softly. "No one can take that from you again." Ruth blinked back tears, her fingers trembling as she touched the sparkling gems. She looked up at her son, pride and love shining in her eyes filled with a quiet sense of peace. "You've built something special here," she said, her voice warm. "Not just a store, but a legacy." Eric squeezed her hand gently. "It wouldn't mean anything without you, Mom." She smiled, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift slightly. Though the pain of that day would never fully fade, she knew it had led to something bigger, a conversation, a change, a step towards something better. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapped around her. Eric watched her go, standing at the doorway of the store he had built in the town that had now embraced a new understanding. Ruth walked away slowly, but with purpose. She was not just a woman who had been wronged. She was a woman who had stood her ground, and that, she knew, would make all the difference.